horse was going to die. The man beside it already had, or so Margaret believed, when she found them both collapsed in her uncle's stable at midnight, until the stranger opened his eyes and asked her not to scream and not to tell anyone he was there. She had come out for the same reason she always did after 11 o'clock, to escape the house before her own thoughts turned unbearable. The candle in her hand trembled, throwing long shadows across the straw. She had expected to find nothing but Duchess, her uncle's ailing mare, and the low, familiar smell of hay and manure that had become, over 4 years, the closest thing to comfort she owned. Instead she found blood. It streaked the stable floor in a dark, glistening trail, leading from the side door to the far stall, where a man lay half-buried in straw, one arm flung over a horse that was shuddering, its flank torn open by something sharp. The horse's breathing was shallow. The man's was worse. Margaret's first instinct was to run for the house. Her second, colder instinct, the one 4 years under her uncle's roof had carved into her, was to ask what it would cost her if she did. If she woke her uncle, Lord Pembroke, he would demand to know why a bleeding stranger and a butchered horse had ended up on his property in the middle of the night, and he would decide, within seconds, that the fault belonged to her. It always did. The broken teacup, the delayed mail, the rain that ruined the wash on the line. All of it, somehow, traced back to Margaret Ashby, the niece nobody had wanted and everybody resented having to keep. The man's eyes opened. They were dark, sharp, and entirely too aware for someone who had clearly lost a great deal of blood. He looked at her, at the candle shaking in her hand, and said, in a voice worn thin with pain but still carrying an unmistakable edge of command, "Don't scream. I wasn't going to. Don't call for anyone either." Margaret set the candle down on an overturned bucket and knelt beside him, examining the wound at his side without asking permission. It was deep, but not, she thought, running through the small store of practical knowledge she'd gathered nursing sick tenants over the years, beyond hope, if it was tended quickly. "You're bleeding onto my uncle's straw," she said. "I would like to know why. Would you prefer I bleed onto his floor instead? I would prefer an explanation." He almost laughed, though it clearly cost him. "I was riding for the coast when 3 men decided my purse was worth more to them than my company. They were wrong on both counts, but they left their opinion here." He gestured weakly toward the wound. "The horse took a worse blade than I did. I'd be grateful if you looked to her first." Margaret looked between the injured man and the injured horse, and made a decision that would, though she did not know it yet, unravel everything she believed about her own worth. She tore a strip from her petticoat and began to work. For the next hour, Margaret moved between horse and man with the brisk, silent competence of someone who had long ago stopped waiting for anyone else to solve her problems. She packed the mare's wound with clean linen and a paste of yarrow she kept, secretly, in a tin beneath her floorboards, knowledge her mother had left her, one of the only things she had left of her before the fever took both her parents and delivered Margaret, penniless, to an uncle who saw her as an obligation rather than family. The man watched her work with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't say why. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I know what desperation teaches you to do." She didn't look up. "There isn't a physician within 6 miles who would come at this hour for people who can't pay him, so one learns." "And do people thank you for it?" Margaret's hands stilled for half a second before resuming their work. "They tolerate me for it. There's a difference." He studied her in the candlelight, the sharp set of her jaw, the calluses on her fingers, the plain, mended dress that had clearly been let out and taken in more times than it was built to survive. She did not look at him the way most people looked at a stranger with an aristocratic accent and expensive, ruined boots. She looked at him the way one looks at a problem requiring a solution. Nothing more, nothing less. "What's your name?" he asked. "Why does it matter?" "Because you've bled my horse's wound closed with your own petticoat, and I find I would like to know who to thank for it, when I'm not in danger of dying on your uncle's floor." She hesitated. In 4 years, she had learned that giving people pieces of herself rarely ended well. But there was something in the exhaustion behind his eyes, something that recognized her own, that made her answer against her better judgment. "Margaret, Margaret," he repeated as though testing the shape of it. "I am in your debt, Margaret. More than you know. You can repay the debt by not dying in this stable. My uncle will make it my fault somehow, and I've quite enough blamed on me as it is. That, finally, did make him laugh. A short, pained sound, but a genuine one. I'll do my best. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the straw beside him, feeding the small fire she dared to build in an old brazier, listening to his breathing even out as the herbs did their work. He told her little of himself, only that he was traveling under circumstances he could not explain, that the men who'd attacked him had likely been paid to do so, and that it was imperative no one in the house learn he had been there. Not even my uncle? She asked. If he found you recovering under his roof, he might see an opportunity in it. He's fond of opportunities. Especially not your uncle. Something dark passed behind the stranger's eyes. I have reasons to distrust every roof between here and London that I have not personally chosen. Yours is the first I've been glad of. By the time the sky outside began to gray, he could sit up unassisted. He insisted on leaving before the household woke, though Margaret could see the effort it cost him to stand. You should rest another day, she said. You'll open the wound again. I've imposed on your kindness long enough. If I'm found here, it endangers you more than it endangers me. He reached for his coat, then paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and disbelief. I don't suppose you would tell me your family name, Margaret, so that I might properly repay this debt when I'm able. She thought of what her uncle would say if a wealthy stranger came calling to thank the niece nobody wanted. It would not go well for her. No, she said, I don't think I would. He nodded slowly, as though he had expected the answer, and did not push further. He mounted the mare, gently, favoring her wounded flank, and disappeared into the pale morning light before the first servant stirred. Margaret stood alone in the empty stable, staring at the blood-stained straw, and felt, for the first time in years, that something in her life had shifted, though she could not yet say into what shape. 3 days later, her uncle received a letter. Margaret was not permitted to read it, but she watched her uncle's face transform as he did, from irritation to confusion, to a kind of hungry, calculating delight that made her stomach turn. He looked up at her across the breakfast table with new eyes. The eyes of a man who has just discovered his least favorite possession is worth a great deal more than he thought. You've been keeping secrets, Margaret, he said. Her aunt set down her teacup with a sharp clink. What secrets? What is he talking about? It seems, Lord Pembroke said, folding the letter with theatrical care, that our niece rendered assistance to a gentleman of considerable standing several nights ago. A gentleman who has written to formally request the opportunity to call upon her and express his gratitude. Margaret's blood went cold. I don't know what you mean. Don't play the fool, girl. The letter bears the seal of the Earl of Ravensmore. The name meant nothing to Margaret directly, but she saw the way her aunt's face drained of color, the way her uncle's hands trembled slightly with barely restrained excitement. Whoever this Earl was, his name carried weight enough to change the temperature of the room. He says you tended his wounds and his horses, in this very stable, at some risk to yourself, and asked nothing in return. Her uncle's eyes narrowed. Is this true? There was no use denying it now. Yes. And you said nothing? You let an earl bleed in my stable and told no one. He asked me not to. An earl's request outweighs your obligation to this family? Her aunt's voice climbed toward hysteria. Do you understand what could have happened if he had died under this roof? Unattended, with no physician summoned? We would have been ruined, questioned, perhaps accused. He didn't die, Margaret said quietly. I made certain of that. Her uncle was no longer listening to the argument. He was already calculating. He wishes to call. Tomorrow. We will receive him properly, and you, Margaret, will conduct yourself with the gratitude and humility this family has always shown you, and not 1 ounce of the insolence you seem so fond of. Margaret said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that silence cost her less than honesty in this house. But beneath the silence, something sharp and unfamiliar was taking root. Not fear, though there was fear in it, but the dawning, dangerous shape of hope. The Earl of Ravensmore arrived the following afternoon in a carriage that made her uncle's entire property look shabby by comparison. Margaret watched from the window as he stepped down, moving carefully, one hand pressed briefly to his side where the wound still pained him, though he straightened before anyone could notice. Julian Voss, Earl of Ravensmore, looked entirely different in daylight, dressed in the unmistakable authority of his title, than he had bleeding in her uncle's straw. And yet, when his eyes found hers across the drawing room, she saw the same man who had thanked her, genuinely without performance, for a kindness that had cost her nothing but risk. Her aunt and uncle fawned over him with a desperation that made Margaret's skin crawl. Tea was served in the good china, reserved for guests far more important than any Margaret had ever been permitted to entertain. Her uncle spoke at length about the family's respectability, their long and distinguished, entirely fabricated history of generosity and honor. Julian listened politely, his expression giving away nothing, until he turned to Margaret directly. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I understand I owe you a great deal more gratitude than a single visit can repay. You saved a valuable animal, and quite possibly my life, and asked for nothing in return." "Anyone would have done the same, my lord," Margaret said carefully, aware of her uncle's eyes boring into her. "I have found, in my experience, that very few people would have," Julian replied. "Fewer still would have kept the matter private at personal risk, rather than using it to their advantage." Her uncle's smile tightened at the implication. "I would like," Julian continued, "to properly thank Miss Ashby. Perhaps a walk in the garden, if her family permits it, so that I might do so without an audience." There was a brief, brittle silence. Refusing an earl was not something her uncle was prepared to do, whatever his misgivings about what Margaret might say unsupervised. Permission was granted with visible reluctance. In the garden, away from listening ears, Julian's careful public formality fell away entirely. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he observed. "I look like someone who knows exactly what my uncle intends to gain from your visit, and it isn't gratitude." "I imagined as much." Julian studied her for a long moment. "May I ask you something honestly, and trust you to answer the same way?" "That depends on the question. Is your life in that house as difficult as I suspect it is?" Margaret considered lying. She had spent 4 years perfecting the art of making her circumstances sound smaller than they were, so as not to invite pity or further punishment. But something about the way he'd asked, plainly without performance, made the practiced deflection feel unnecessary. "Yes," she said simply. Julian nodded, as though the answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I did not come here only to thank you, Margaret. I came because I could not stop thinking about the fact that a woman who had every reason to abandon a stranger to his fate chose, instead, to save him, at real cost to herself, expecting nothing. I have spent my life surrounded by people calculating what they might gain from every kindness they perform. You didn't know who I was. You still helped. Would you have preferred I let you die, to test whether my motives were pure?" That earned a genuine smile. "No. I find I am rather glad you didn't." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet pouch, offering it to her. She didn't take it. "I don't want payment," she said. "I told you that in the stable." "It isn't payment." His voice was quieter now, more serious. "It's an offer. I have a great deal of influence, Margaret, and very little patience left for pretending my life is anything but what it is. An endless series of transactions dressed up as courtesy. You are the only person who has looked at me without calculating what I'm worth to them. I would like the chance to know you properly, not as a debt to repay, as something else entirely." Margaret's throat tightened. "You don't know me. I know that you tended a stranger's wounds at midnight and asked for nothing. I know that you kept his secret at risk to yourself. I know that you speak to me plainly, without artifice, in a way no one in my world has dared to in years. I would like the opportunity to know the rest." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a version of her life that did not end in this garden, in this house, under the weight of her uncle's endless calculations. "My uncle will try to use this," she warned him. "Whatever this is, he'll see only what he can gain. Then we will simply have to disappoint him, Julian said. By making certain that whatever happens next belongs entirely to you and to no one else. It did not happen quickly, and it did not happen easily. Her uncle attempted, more than once, to insert himself into the courtship that followed, hosting dinners designed to showcase a family respectability that had never existed. Angling for financial arrangements, Julian firmly and repeatedly declined to discuss with anyone but Margaret herself. But over the weeks that followed, in gardens and drawing rooms and the rare private conversations her uncle couldn't prevent, Margaret found something she had stopped believing existed. A person who wanted to know her, not use her, who asked what she thought and waited for the answer, who remembered, without being told twice, that she took her tea without sugar and preferred blunt honesty to polite fiction. When Julian finally asked her to marry him, it was not in a ballroom or a garden staged for an audience. It was in the same stable where they had first met, late at night, with no one else present to calculate what either of them stood to gain. "I have nothing to offer you that matters to people like your uncle," Margaret told him. "No dowry, no family name worth mentioning. Nothing but what I am. That," Julian said, "is the only thing I've ever actually wanted from anyone." She said yes. When Julian informed her uncle of the engagement, Lord Pembroke's excitement curdled instantly into resentment the moment he realized there would be no fortune-changing hands to secure his approval, only a firm, final statement that Margaret would leave his household immediately, and that any future correspondence from him would not be welcome. Her aunt wept theatrical tears about ingratitude. Her uncle blustered about respect and family obligation, words that had never once applied to how they treated her. Margaret listened to all of it standing beside Julian, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, entirely unafraid. "You called me the useless one," she said quietly, before she turned to leave the house that had never once been a home. "I hope you find someone else's usefulness to depend on. I'm finished offering you mine." She did not look back as she walked out the door. If you loved watching Margaret go from the family's forgotten burden to a woman who finally chose herself, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next story. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done, kneeling in that stable at midnight, with a stranger's life in your hands? Share this video with someone who believes kindness should never be a liability.